Thank you. And Dr. Julia Kopich.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. It's Kopich. You were very close. You pronounced it phonetically. I'm going to use my 10 minutes to talk about what I think is the topical thread that runs through all three bills, and that is teacher evaluation. And I think when we talk about teacher evaluation, we have to kind of take a step back and begin by asking, what's the purpose of evaluation? The immediate response of most people is to root out the bad apples. And it's pretty hard to argue that bad teachers ought to be kept in a classroom. I don't know anybody who'd make that argument. But I think we need to consider if this kind of narrow definition of an evaluation system can ensure that a vibrant and well-prepared and effective teaching force for California. So I think there is some growing evidence that, in fact, a somewhat different approach, namely evaluation being part of an integral and continuous professional growth and development cycle, may hold more promise than evaluation as a one-time kind of drive-by event. And so I want to turn our attention for a moment to someplace not close to home, Massachusetts. In 2011, the state of Massachusetts enacted the Educator Evaluation System. It's a very comprehensive statewide framework. It was developed by multiple stakeholders at the state level, and it's a multiple measures evaluation system. It includes classroom observations, portfolios that document teacher professional growth. It includes test scores, but only for formative purposes, and it requires annual evaluations. It's a pretty impressive model from which California can learn a lot, much of it positive and good. How it was developed, the elements it contains are very useful, I think, in a California context. I was on the research team that recently completed a 3-year study of Massachusetts' evaluation system, and I want to talk about a couple of areas of learning that I think are particularly relevant to this hearing. The first is annual evaluations. It turns out that annual evaluations are having unintended consequences, those being the following. The state of Massachusetts intends this to be a system that focuses on teacher professional growth, but the annualness of a teacher evaluation rating reinforces kind of a gotcha mentality among teachers and principals. Secondly, this system, evaluating everybody every year, is killing off the school administrators. It has increased the workload so substantially without sufficient, in our judgment, bang for the buck, that we raised the question with Massachusetts about whether this is the best use of always finite resources to evaluate everybody every year. So let me say a word about what we found about classroom observations. The system requires observations. I believe observations are really a key part of any evaluation system. But if Massachusetts is any indication, we actually have evidence from California too. They're not easy to do well. Massachusetts provided a lot of training for classroom observers, most of whom in that state are school administrators. And what the state thought was adequate wasn't nearly enough. So here are the dilemmas they confronted. Implementing a common understanding of good teaching has been challenging. The state developed rubrics that all the stakeholders agreed were good rubrics that defined effective teaching. Getting principals to use them effectively has been a heavy lift. Secondly is the issue of inter-rater reliability. How do you try to make sure that a teacher's performance rating is not dependent on whom she happens to get as her evaluator? And third is the dilemma of moving from description to actionable feedback. We found that observers were very good at describing what they saw in classrooms and far less skilled at saying, here's what I saw, and then here, teacher, is what you might do about it to shore up areas where you might need a little help. We have some real-life examples in California about how to overcome these observation challenges, and they're found in the long-standing peer review systems in San Juan and Poway. In 2011, I was one of the researchers that did a study of the peer review systems in those two districts. And in our report, Getting Serious About Teacher Support and Evaluation, we described how these programs equip the consulting teachers, who are really the heart and soul of the work that PAR does, how they equip them to provide targeted support and sound, valid, and credible performance reviews. 2 years after the PAR study, we conducted a review of California's early career policies: induction, evaluation, and achieving permanent status. And a couple of the findings here are relevant to this hearing as well. Beginning teachers and their principals alike reported that California's current evaluation system is largely unhelpful in diagnosing teachers' needs or designing support or appraising professional performance. On permanency, principals said, well, yeah, there's an evaluation system, but it's really not rigorous enough for me to use to make a high-stakes decision by permanency. So either I kind of opt out of making the decision, or I make it based on my professional judgment. But the evaluation system doesn't do it. I would suggest, with all due respect, that simply extending the time to permanency will not solve that problem. And a word about layoffs. Hopefully California won't return to the bad old days of the Great Recession when layoffs were the order of the day, but none of us can predict that. It does seem, though, that the data about the evaluation's shaky efficacy for making tenure decisions raises serious questions about its value for determining the order of layoffs. So California has a looming challenge, which some of you already have mentioned, that being the teacher shortage. The results of PACE's Year 2 study of implementation of the local control funding formula, which was released last week, shows that the shortage is already here. And if past California experience is any gauge, teachers for LCFF target students, primarily low-income English learners, those teachers will be in the shortest supply. So our immediate dilemma, I'd suggest, is not deciding whom to lay off, but how to attract and retain enough talented teachers to meet the state's promise to historically underrepresented students. In sum, California has a pretty substantial set of teacher-related issues that actually do need to be addressed. It needs a policy agenda that matches that set of issues. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you.
Thank you. And Dr. Ken Futternick. He's the director of school turnaround. He's the director of the School Turnaround Center from West Ed.
I was.
You're retired now.
So,
I didn't want to mention that. Did you?
About a year and
You're
a half
still a
ago.
turnaround guy, so.
Yeah. And it's Futternick, by the way. Thank you.
Oh, there we go again. Thank you.
I just want to comment on what one thing Dr. Goldhaber said, and it really sort of underlines his analysis. And it was a sort of common theme in the Vergara trial, where I was also served as an expert witness. It's very easy and sometimes kind of convenient to slip from an idea of what a good teacher is, which is what we're talking about, to this notion of an effective teacher. And when you talk about effective teachers in the studies that he referred to, those are based on value-added models, which are reflect a teacher's ability to raise test scores. And what Dr. Kopic talked about, the importance of observations, are not included in those analyses of effectiveness. And so it becomes convenient just to suddenly start talking about these so-called effective teachers that are being laid off and the harm that does to kids, without any reference at all to whether those value-added models are valid and reliable. The American Statistical Association came out with a paper recently and said they thought they were not valid and reliable, and in fact are dangerous for making these kinds of analyses. The American Educational Research Association just came out with a very detailed policy statement about those analyses. So I just think, as a reminder, we have to be careful about using these seemingly objective sorts of analyses for describing something that is much harder to get our hands around, which is a multiple measure system of evaluation that does include observations by trained observers. So with that, I want to just make some high-level comments about the three issues we're talking about and put this in context a little bit. Dr. Kopic made reference to the teacher shortage, and the chair of this committee stated early on that we have largely ignored the pressing need to recruit and support high-quality teachers. What I would say, and I think it's important to realize, is that we can't recruit quality teachers if nobody wants to become a teacher. California has to fill 20,000 new teaching positions. That's based on a slight increase in projected enrollment and a wave of retirements coming. You may be familiar with this data from the California Commission for Teacher Credentialing. In the last 5 years, there's been a 55% drop in applications for teacher programs. So we are, just to support what Dr. Kopic said, we are at the front end of a very serious teacher shortage. 3 quick points about that. First is that addressing the issues today of evaluation and probation and RIF policies are really important. But far more students, particularly poor students and minority students, are going to be adversely affected if we don't solve the teacher shortage than if we don't do anything about the 3 issues that we're dealing with today. That's the first point. Second point is the issues under consideration today are in part about how we rid the system of bad, so-called bad teachers. That strategy only works if you have good ones waiting to take their place. And in the areas of math, special education, science, and generally in schools that serve high poverty populations, there are not people to replace them. So we have to bear that in mind. And thirdly, if we don't get some of these issues right around evaluation and our RIF policies and probation, we can actually exacerbate the problem. Let me give you an example. What if California extended the probation period for novice teachers? The proponents and the author of the bill said it would give principals more time to evaluate novice teachers before making those high-stakes decisions. What it may do is increase the level of anxiety that people feel about having to wait another year, 2 years. He mentioned maybe we want to go beyond 3 years of job security concerns that young teachers have. We know from research on the charter schools that typically don't have job security for the teachers that attrition rates are much higher. And the study that I'm familiar with that I'd be happy to share with you is that teaching conditions, including job security, is a significant factor in the higher attrition rates among teachers in charter schools. There's also another point that came up in the Vergara trial, and that is if we're not really looking carefully at teachers in the first 2 years, or in practical terms, it's closer to 18 months, ineffective teachers will actually stay in the classroom longer if we don't make the important decision early on to make sure that they leave if they haven't demonstrated their ability to teach effectively. So I want to turn now to teacher evaluation, and I want to also, and it turns out Dr. Kopic and I hadn't talked about this until very recently, and we said, what are you going to talk about? And it turned out we both coincidentally decided that we were going to talk about Massachusetts, and I want to go into a little bit more detail. But as I do that, and I want to say something Dr. Kopic didn't say, in case you don't know this, Massachusetts has, for many years, been one of the highest performing, if not the highest performing state in the country. And so it behooves us to pay attention to their policies, particularly around educator evaluation. I want you to imagine that this bell curve on the screen represents all of the teachers in California, and to the right tail of the bell curve would represent those who are most accomplished. On the left would be the ones least accomplished. In the middle would represent the big medal of people somewhere in between. Teacher evaluation, the way it's typically conceived, focuses on the bottom tail of the bell curve. And the idea is if we have a really good teacher evaluation system, it would get rid of people at that end of the bell curve. What I think a good teacher evaluation system should do, and I'm not alone in this, and I think we would all agree, is that really ought to look at everyone in the system and in addition to focusing on people at the bottom tail. And if we did that, this is what could happen. We would move, as some people refer to, the big middle of the bell curve to the right. And far more students in California would benefit by having an evaluation system that did that than simply lopping off the bottom of the bell curve. And even if you lopped off the tail of the bell curve, it only makes a difference if you have great people to take their place. And the schools that matter most, where we care most about making sure students have access to great teachers, they don't have those people waiting in the wings to take their place. So what is a high-quality teacher evaluation? This is what it could do. So here's some highlights from Massachusetts. It includes tools, guidance, sample contract language to support the evaluation of all educators. That's not just the ones who are struggling, and it's also not just teachers. It includes superintendents and principals. Secondly, there are model rubrics, detailed descriptions of practice for superintendents, administrators, and teachers. The districts, this is really an important point here. Districts in Massachusetts may adopt that model. They may adapt it. So Sacramento was not telling all districts you must use it. You can use it, and you can also adapt the model, or you can create your own system if you want. But the system has to be consistent with the criteria that we set. I think the criteria that I've read that exist in some of the bills that have already been talked about, as well as in the O'Donnell bill and the Liu bill, are excellent criteria. And the state would simply be say, if you want to develop yours from bottom up, you're fine. But if you want to use our state-adopted system, in Massachusetts, the vast majority in the few years since 2011 have actually adopted or adapted their model. It was developed collaboratively by education stakeholders in the state. That's really critical because you're not going to get buy-in, as you haven't from people with the STUL Act, unless people come together and develop a system. And I would say this, that California is really leading the country in the last couple of years in having labor and management come together and work very closely. Several of us in the room were just at a labor management conference yesterday in Emeryville, where there were 30 districts. They're working on labor management collaboration. All of the state leaders, CTA, the CFT, CSBA, and AXA have come together and pledged a willingness to work together. So I think this is eminently possible. Now I want to point to what tends to be more controversial, and that is the Massachusetts model system, and it has a component that requires districts focus on the impact on student learning. And here are some highlights from that. It must be district-determined multiple measures of student learning, growth, and achievement. So it doesn't ignore at all the effect that a teacher has on students in terms of growth and achievement. Each measure must be aligned to content for the course of the class. Each measure must be informative and help guide instruction. So districts are encouraged to look beyond year-end standardized test results, and districts are encouraged to focus on all academic standards, as well as social and emotional learning. And finally, they provide sample assessment guides and evaluation rubrics that are provided by the state. Just the last slide here. The benefits of this approach for California: it's collaboratively designed, which will result in greater local buy-in. And with all due respect to the idea that if holding people accountable to the STUL Act hasn't worked for a reason, for many reasons. And using sticks and carrots to try to get districts to do what they haven't done since the thing was put on the books is not going to solve the problem, in my opinion. Another advantage here is that the system can be used for formative and summative evaluations. It's a system in Massachusetts that addresses the entire bell curve, not just the bottom tail. It's a coherent, comprehensive system for teachers and administrators, and it provides ready-to-use working models that can be adapted at the local level. And I think I'll leave it at that. The very last slide, I think this quote is worth mentioning, especially in light of our desire to come up with a solution to the RIF policy. And I would be the first to say that the use of seniority is far from a perfect way to do it. But we have to bear in mind what Thomas Talk and his colleague Rothman said in their article, Rush to Judgment. The typical teacher evaluation in public education consists of a single fleeting observation or a classroom visit by a principal or other building administrator untrained in evaluation who wields a checklist of classroom conditions and teacher behaviors that often don't focus directly on the quality of instruction. So when we talk about performance being in a significant way of determining who's going to go, and we're basing it on that kind of an evaluation, which is quite prominent, in my view, in California, then we're setting up a system that's going to be perceived as unfair and arbitrary. Ideally, if California had a great evaluation system, I would strongly support, the idea of combining performance with some consideration of seniority, but we don't have that system. In fact, that's one of the reasons we're here, is to figure out what kind of evaluation system we would have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. Let me ask a question here. With regard to the Massachusetts system, would you say is that the example if you were to look at the entire United States? Is Massachusetts it? Do you think they have it down best?
In my view, it is the strongest one. Now, but I'm not arguing that we adopt their system. The approach is great. I think we're going to hear from San Juan. I know a little bit about it. I think there's some advantages to the way that they have created it. I think California should develop its own system. But the reason I think Dr. Kopic and I pointed there, it's extremely difficult for 1,000 school districts to create their own evaluation system. And that's one of the reasons they don't exist. And what they did in Massachusetts, they said, we're going to develop one together, not the state, but the stakeholders, and we're going to allow you to use it if you'd like. And if you want to adapt it and change it to your local needs, or if you want to create your own, you can. California, I think, would be well advised to develop the same kind of system, but make it California's system.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And with regard to that Massachusetts system does have a component of student progress. Is that correct?
Right.
And talk to me about those measures and what they might look like. You said it might be a summative. Would it ever be a formative? And might the summative not even be a test per se? Could it be a work product?
Yeah,
yes, it can be.
They're called district-determined measures. And in the first couple of years, they were assessments. They didn't work very well because districts weren't great at developing valid and reliable assessments. They're getting a little better at it. They can be anything the district chooses them to be. Interestingly, that piece is not part of the teacher rating per se. It is used more for formative and more to inform the district. So it is used as a way to help teachers figure out what kind of professional growth they need and in what areas. In the same way that the state assessment is used for formative purposes. I will admit that by the time our 3-year evaluation of the system was concluded, most districts were just beginning on the district-determined measure, so I can't give you a definitive answer. I'd also point out that as Ken said, yes, the system is meant to be for teachers and administrators. It was kind of funny, though. When the system began, the administrator said, we'll go first. We'll model this. We'll show you what it looks like. By the time our 3-year review was over, every teacher had been evaluated and maybe 20% of the principals.
I get it. Okay. And again, there was some comment with regard to the formal evaluation. Remember, teachers are evaluated every day, every minute on campus. You drive onto that campus, you're being evaluated. But the formal evaluation typically occurs every year during the probation period, then every other year, unless there's some reason to re-engage in an observation. In Massachusetts, you're saying the difference is they do it every year, the formal, and there seems to be some struggle with that?
Yeah, the system, well, we'll see how much struggle there is. We recommended that they were frustrated. The state was frustrated because they thought annual evaluations were good. Largely, so Massachusetts was a race to the top state. Mm-hmm. So the federal requirements around teacher evaluation, one of which was annual evaluations for everybody, was part of the was one of the criterion for accepting the federal funds. That's why Massachusetts initially did annual evaluations. They're now thinking that maybe that's not such a good idea because they are extraordinarily expensive, and there really isn't time in one school year for someone to think about professional growth, to actually put it into action, to see if it has results in the classroom and for her students. So what we recommended in our study was that they think about every year for probationary teachers, actually every 3 years for people who are generally considered doing well, and every year for teachers whom the principals determine are in some kind of professional jeopardy. Whether the state will move to that or not, I can't tell you.
But currently it's every year, formal.
Yep.
Every year.
Yep.
Okay, and I can see where that would be pretty challenging on the logistical side.
Oof.
Just coming from a high school where there's about 140 teachers, administrators maybe 8, give or take.
The
for
workload.
Them to walk into every class every
Right.
year. It takes hours.
Right.
Each time they evaluate one teacher, each day.
Right.
And to do that, they would be evaluating every day of the school year is what they'd be doing. They wouldn't be able to tend to any other administrative functions, would they?
Which is basically what happened. That's what principals were complaining about, that even if they had a vice principal, 2 vice principals, that those were the people who conducted the observations, who reviewed the portfolios, who did all of the other kinds of activities involved in producing an annual rating. And the state didn't take anything off their plates, and so their already overloaded workloads became more overloaded, and it raised serious questions about what other kinds of issues they were able to attend to.
Okay.
It would also suggest that we think about the use of other certified or authorized evaluators. And I think San Juan may talk about some ideas about that, because to have one principal responsible for all of the evaluations, when the principal may be very busy doing lots of other things or may not be particularly good at doing evaluations, it behooves districts to have other people who are carefully supported and selected and who can do reliable evaluations as well, particularly in large high schools.
Okay, just for the committee's information, evaluating a teacher does take time.
Yeah.
Typically, in an evaluation, a formal evaluation, you'd meet with the principal at a minimum once prior to the evaluation. Typically, you turn in a lesson plan before that principal or vice principal it maybe comes into your classroom to evaluate you. They'd be in there for a good hour, at least an hour. And then they'd come again, and then there'd be another meeting, and then there'd be a meeting at the end of the year, but there'd also be drop-ins throughout the year several times, at a minimum several times, where they would be evaluating you. So it's not just a 2-day event, it's an all-year event, and it takes time, because they have to write this up. This has to be, this isn't, they just check the boxes. Right. This is, there's a pretty healthy narrative involved in the evaluation process, and feedback throughout the year. And necessary feedback throughout the year. They can be just dropping in. The principal can leave a note. They're going to save their copy of that note because they're going to write up a formal evaluation at the end of the year that you will then sign, so that you can get some feedback. So again, it's a laborious process at a minimum, in my experience. So
and
with
a really
that,
important process.
I'm sorry.
And a really important process, because if you're not just doing what some evaluators do, which is coming into classrooms where teachers are doing well and giving the thumbs up and walking out saying, don't worry about it, you're fine. Good teachers want to be evaluated. They want feedback. They want to get better. And that's this idea of moving the big middle to the right and not ignoring them, because we can really help all students improve if we provide a system that allows all teachers to get the feedback that they want to improve.
Yeah, and I've been in that exact position where I wanted feedback, and the principal said, "You're doing fine.
Yeah.
I love what you're doing."
No, right.
Well, couldn't we get into more detail? No, everybody needs improvement somewhere. I'm sure I did, but I didn't get that feedback, and that would have helped me to have that feedback. It would have helped me. It made me feel more comfortable with where I was and where I was going as a classroom teacher.
Right.
Thank you. A quick one, yes.
Thank you. I appreciate you all being here. I actually agreed with much of what all three of you had to say, and I think you very well articulated the challenges in having a robust and meaningful evaluation system, and in the fact that all of these issues have to be able to work together in a package, that just extending, as you said, the probationary time period, and if that's all we do, that's insufficient. So they really do have to work all together, and I think that's the goal, is to be able to move these reforms forward in a meaningful way and in a way where they're complementary of each other. So having said that, because I agree, you've well articulated, as I said, that it is no easy achievement to develop an evaluation system that works, that can actually be implemented, that is meaningful, that is accurate. But having said that, and then to use that system for layoff decisions, should another economic downturn come, et cetera. But having said that, in where we stand today, knowing that we have the systems in place that we do, Dr. Kopich, do you believe that LIFO, or seniority, is the best policy that schools should be using during unfortunate times where we are facing layoffs?